Hi, this is Ehan Deravi, aka John Craig of Real Rover Podcast. Roving between East and West, we hope to develop a more finessed understanding of consciousness, how it relates to the brain, how it relates to altered states, and in particular, where we are going forward towards in our understanding of the universe and being itself. Now, today we have a very special guest, and I know many interviewers say today we have a very special guest, but today we really have a very special guest. And it came to my attention last year through one of my associates, Ms. Jun Mayamura, who has done so much exemplary work subtitling some of our interviews into Japanese, because I want these interviews to be available broadly to the Japanese public who otherwise would not be able to access the content because of linguistic challenges. So June herself found this book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven, by Christopher M. Bache, PhD, last year, and decided that she would translate it as her first work. And when I read this book, it was shock and awe. Wow! Here is an academic who has gone on a journey, literally, where no man has gone before and come back and recorded so clearly. That's the point. Because as you will find out during this interview, Christopher Bache undertook a series of 73 journeys in an altered state of consciousness initiated by a high dosage of LSD. And for those of you who may have no understanding of LSD, here's a short introduction.
There was quite a lot of sensation. At some stages, it felt like I lost contact with my body. You're relaxing on a beach, beautiful bit of nature, totally relaxed. I think that it's easier to access that part of your psyche, of your brain. But when you're in this research environment and the research is everywhere, quite invasive MRI machine, and I think it's probably less likely to happen.
We began our discussion, which honestly I thought was all being recorded. But to my horror, as an interviewer, I discovered, because we went online and offline and back online again, changing rooms, that I had recorded the very beginning of the first session before the rooms were changed. And then I forgot to click the button. Boom, boom, boom. So it struck me as interesting that our session was kind of divided into two. The first half, I was convinced being recorded, but it wasn't. And when I overcame the shock of understanding that, because you never get another shot at an interview like this, it's never the same. And I considered the discourse today that he provided for us to be extremely forthright, easy, and brilliant in every way. But it was during the second half that he really brought us closer to understanding the importance, the significance, the depth of what he had experienced and why perhaps we need to know that now. So in the first half, I actually began by quoting the foreword to the book. And the introduction. The foreword was written by none other than Ervin Laszlo, creator of the Budapest Club, a brilliant thinker and philosopher himself. And he writes in his foreword the following: "This is one of the most insightful and significant books I have ever read." Just stop there. He is a systems theorist, a man who's not only a genius musician, a child prodigy, but who basically teaches himself a lot of the sciences, who develops his own philosophy, develops the Budapest Club, and is one of the forefront thinkers right now, giving us some clues as to where we might be moving as a species, who understands consciousness, who understands physics, who understands quantum theory, and can bring them all together. But to understand its significance and to endorse its message, one must be willing to entertain three premises: that there is an intelligence behind the things that exist in the universe. 2, that there is purpose exhibited by this intelligence. And, very important for this discussion, that it is humanly possible to access some elements of this intelligence and learn some aspects of its purpose. Well, that's exactly what Dr. Christopher Bache did. He accessed some elements of this intelligence, and he certainly learned some aspects of its purpose, as you will hear during this truly amazing interview. So now, for the first part of the discussion with Dr. Bache, who I met for the first time today, we started off by reading the introduction of his book itself. So for those who have absolutely no idea what this subject is about, in his own words, this is how we began. 73 days. Shortly after beginning my career as a university professor in northeastern Ohio, I made a decision that changed the course of my life. Between 1979 and 1999, I chose to take LSD 73 times in carefully planned, therapeutically structured sessions. I did this to explore my mind and the mind of the universe as deeply and systematically as I could. This book is about what happened on those 73 days and why it matters. That's exactly what this book is about. And he did mention that he had even taught courses in mysticism and an outline of psychedelic work without mentioning that he was part of it at all. So it's important to understand that here we have a fully trained academic who comes out of the system, agnostic, verging on atheistic, but with a truly strong desire to go deeper, to understand reality at a deeper level. And it was at that point that he came across the work of this gentleman, Dr. Stanislav Grof. Now, Stanislav Grof, I'll give you a short introduction to here because it's important.
I have been interested in these non-ordinary experiences for which current psychiatry and psychology has no special name. They're all put in the category of altered states of consciousness. What it suggests somehow is that there's a correct way of experiencing ourselves and the world, and that in these states it's distorted. It's not easy to really question some of the really fundamental assumptions.
Stan Grof is known as a pioneer of psychedelic psychotherapy.
And in 1954, we got a sample of LSD. When my own experience was culminating, my consciousness was catapulted out of my body. I became nothing, but I became nothing. I became everything.
For most of my life, I felt like I really didn't belong here. Like I was born on the wrong planet. I had to meet Stan. I knew he held the wisdom I needed.
One after another told me that they believe that what they are experiencing must be a reliving of birth. Equipped with current psychiatry, I just had no clue. You cannot learn that from books what these patients are going through. Holotropic breathwork is an experiential approach to self-exploration, to therapy, which uses faster breathing, powerful evocative music, and also a certain kind of body work. After the session, they try to communicate what happened to them in a graphic way.
It was time for me to find out what shadows were lurking in my unconscious. Would I have the courage to confront them?
If anybody's paying attention, they're traumatized in some way.
We're basically all skating on thin ice. There's a profound sense of uncertainty.
The pain was so intense. I was also tapping into the collective sadness, and what a depth of it there was.
Changing the situation is not simple. We cannot just do transpersonal spiritual sanitization.
Bad trips and negative material were actually a royal road to transformative healing.
The way to resolve traumatic unconscious memory would be if that material fully emerges into consciousness.
Stan represents the long through line, a work over decades.
He uncovered the deep structure, the archetypal pattern, you might say, of the life process.
That kind of innocence that Stan has, he has this tremendous appreciation for everything.
There is a beauty and there is an intelligence which cannot come out of matter.
So Stanislav Grof's book, this book, influenced him so profoundly that he immediately decided that it was behooving of him to undertake a series of psychedelic journeys to understand his own mind and the mind of the universe even more deeply. And it was Stanislav Grof's book and its recommendations and its instructions for how to undertake a session that allowed him the very important set and setting to do it with his wife, who was a trained psychologist and was very aware of what he was doing and what he was attempting, even though she wasn't in the same altered state herself. She looked after his body, literally, while he was out of consensus reality for many hours at a time during these 73 sessions. And he always did it alone. He never did it with any other people, and he kept it entirely private. Very important. He kept it entirely private. And as you will read in this book, he came back, he played music during the sessions, which helped him to relax, but also allowed him, when replaying the music, to get his memory back to exactly what he's experienced so that he could write it. Because, as we later discuss in the interview, shamanically induced states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, higher states of consciousness than this, are quite difficult to keep in the three-dimensional mind after one has returned from a hyperdimensional, transdimensional journey. That's important. He recorded every single session from beginning to end and meticulously kept this going through 73 sessions. That alone makes the book worthy of profound consideration. Nobody else that I know of has gone to such extreme lengths to explore this territory, the mind of the universe. But then to record it so well makes it totally unique. We continued our discussion, and I'll just mention some of the highlights of it before we get into the main second half here. During our discussion, he told me how the sessions had been accompanied by extreme purification. And so he mentioned that not only in the psychedelic experience, but also in the annals of great mystics throughout history, suffering, pain, purification always seems to be part of the process. And in his case, every single session, the first half of it approximately, he had to endure purification. Now, what is this purification? We had earlier talked about blocks that one gets during meditation, because when your body sits still, as in Zazen, then all that there is to experience, since the body's not moving and sensory input is at a minimum, all there is to experience is what is sitting here. What is sitting? Who is sitting? And so one tends to become aware of aspects of oneself that normally get hidden or covered or suppressed by physical five-sense-based experience. In other words, we start to feel and come face to face with who we really are. And these are the blocks that require purification, and that all mystics and meditators the worldwide have told us these stories from time immemorial. So he had already experienced those blocks. So when you're talking about the purification that occurs during these amazing psychedelic voyages into uncharted territory, it's simply that our present little cup of consciousness needs to be broken to open up to this amazing wider field of universal consciousness. And that's my own words, not his. But that's what we were talking about. And I mentioned that some people would assume that after you've done a certain amount of trips, then you can get rid of the purification and get to the juicy second half, which is the ecstatic, joyful, encouraging, loving, hopeful, light and blasted part of the session. That's an enormous grace, a gift, but it seems to be dependent on the purification. So I had asked him, do you really have to go through that every time? And he said, yes, actually you do. Because the more you experience, there are levels and levels and levels and levels and more levels to the universe, even levels of light itself. And even when you think you've arrived somewhere, it's just the doorway to another departure for which you need yet another purification. It goes on and on and on. All of this is written about in detail in his book. So I encourage all of you watching this, read what he's talking about. But we had a very natural and easy communication for the first half of this interview. And we covered we didn't go into detail about each of these individual journeys because that's why there's a book. We don't need to discuss that. What we were rather more interested in was the position that psychedelic renaissance has in our world today. We discussed that and how now we're definitely at a turning point in history where psychedelic research is really coming to the forefront. And perhaps there'll be more of that as you listen to the interview that's about to unfold. So in summary, we're about to hear from a man who, in a sense, if we were to interview an astronaut who'd just come back from Alpha Centauri after a 20-year space journey, and he'd done it alone, and he had been where literally no man had ever been before. He was an astronaut. What would we ask him? And how would he be able to communicate what he had experienced on Alpha Centauri? Well, again, it's a poor analogy, I understand. But that's kind of what it's like to interview somebody of the stature of Dr. Christopher Bache. And so without further ado, let's go straight into the part of the interview that I remembered to press the recording button for. Please enjoy. And please read this book. And if you're like me, you'll get undying treasures from it. Those are the diamonds from heaven that are referred to in the subtitle. Here we go.
And therefore, our brain creates our consciousness. And so if matter is the only thing that's real, then as soon as our brain dies, our consciousness disappears, we disappear, we wink out of existence. And correlated with this is the idea that the physical universe is evolving by chance, random necessity, and the brutal, survival of the fittest. When one enters into deep states of consciousness that become available either through meditation or through psychedelics, one discovers a very, very different reality. One discovers that consciousness is not dependent completely on the structures of biology, that there are dimensions of consciousness which are beyond time-space physical reality, and that there is an intelligence that saturates the universe, which one can tap into, and so that my intelligence is part of the intelligence of the universe. The intelligence that we see expressing itself in evolution, in the formation of stars and galaxies and solar systems, is an intelligence that we can tap into. We can have communion with this intelligence. And most importantly, I think, in that process, we completely lose our fear of dying. There is absolutely nothing to fear in the death of this physical body.
I deeply appreciate those words. I can envisage such a future where professionally trained people, scientists, artists included, people who have a grounded base to start with, work together using this amazing tool. You talked a little bit about the neurochemistry, which is being substantially researched right now. For example, how DMT seems to be present in the human brain. How is it that we seem to be built this way from the very beginning? Our neurological setup is able to have these receptors for things that we will never find out about unless we really search for them. What are your feelings on that, Chris? Are we designed to be at a certain stage in our evolution psychonauts?
Yeah. I try to be very careful to stay within my areas of expertise. And this is a question which goes beyond my areas of expertise. It's a question that we need to be speaking to anthropologists about. and biologists about, but clearly we have these receptors in the brain, and it does at least appear on the surface that we are almost designed to enter into non-ordinary states of consciousness. We have certain receptors in our brain that only respond to THC. They don't link with anything else except the active molecule in marijuana. We have receptors that are designed that work with DMT, and we have DMT that runs throughout our body in organic ways. So it certainly does look like our system is pre-tuned to interact with these substances so that these substances can unlock potentials within our human psychophysiology. What's really behind these, why this is this way, I only have layman's perceptions, and my opinion is not really worth anything specifically. But I do know that if we use these substances conscientiously, and if we use them systematically, they begin to initiate us into the consciousness of the universe, into the mind of the universe. I never encountered individual beings so much in my sessions. I never encountered, this consciousness never wore a face. It never wore a face of a deity or a face of any kind of conventional type of wisdom. But I always experienced my sessions being orchestrated by an extraordinary intelligence, I would want to call it almost a supreme intelligence, except I don't want to use that theistic language. But an extraordinary intelligence which took me deeper and deeper and deeper into itself. And we seem to be wired for that kind of experience.
I would agree wholeheartedly. The research certainly seems to be pointing us in that direction. So at this point in our talk, to briefly recap, you had 73 sessions, which we don't need to go into here. People have to read this book. They have to sit with it and deal with it. Sit with it and deal with it. This is an honest report by an honest man about something that really happened. And he just happens to have pretty strong economic credentials in the philosophy of religion, which we should not forget. So you went into it as a knowledgeable person, but just about everything that you thought you knew was purified. And you developed a relationship with what we're looking at on both of our screens here, which is the consciousness or the mind of the universe. And very importantly, it didn't dress itself up as Jesus or Muhammad or some ascended master or somebody claiming to be from this star or that star, which I think is really important, because in some of the other psychedelic literature, self-transforming dwarfs show up. Well, who in the hell are they, right? Yeah. Who are the self-transforming dwarfs? And what have they got to do with reality? And so, there is a certain amount of caution has to be used, which is why in the ancient days, all of the great mystics always warned us, be careful out there. You didn't seem to encounter such negative, apparently individualized entities. You describe it as the mind of the universe. And I think that kind of makes your journey very unique. I don't think I've ever read anywhere of somebody who had such a clean interface, a very clean interface with this mind, albeit a very fast evolving and difficult one. So we've got to this stage in our discussion, and we've understood that the future is very bright for psychedelic research if we do it right. If we bring in the anthropologists, the physicists, the astronomers, and if they go through the process and are humble enough to accept that they're going to have to be purified of a lot of their concepts about reality, that's a very important point too, prepare themselves. Then as humanity moves forward, there's some really interesting things that you see coming in the future, because towards the end of it, you talk about the future of humanity. So let's just go into that vision of how you see the future of humanity unfolding from what you learned in these sessions.
Yeah, that's a big jump, and
Yeah.
I know it's challenging for listeners to even hear this and to even imagine the possibility. So I just want to mention, I did this work for 20 years, from 1979 to 1999, and then I waited 20 years to publish LSD in the Mind of the Universe. I spent many, many years thinking about these experiences and digesting them and absorbing them, and it took me several years just to get myself psychologically in a space where I could share them, where I would be willing to share them. And then it took me 5 years to write the book. The job there is just to present the experiences as cleanly and clearly as I could, so that other people could see what I saw, could have an experience of what I experienced. One of the great surprises for me in this journey is how far, when I began this work, I thought I was doing this for my personal clarification, my personal purification, my personal enlightenment. And what happened is that quickly fell out. It quickly fell away. And my experiences became very much collective, part of the collective psyche, part of humanity. So I learned that when you pop the bubble of your individual identity, you don't simply dissolve into oneness right away. You dissolve into deeper fields, larger fields of reality. And one of those fields is the field of your species, the mind of your species. So that just as I individually have a history, and I believe in reincarnation, and my history goes back through multiple lifetimes, part of that history is my species has a history, that humanity has a history. And I began to be dropped into the mind of humanity at large. And then I began to have experiences about where humanity has been going and where humanity is going. I began to have experiences that humanity is coming to a crescendo in its spiritual history, that humanity is coming into a bifurcation point, Irvin Laszlo calls it, coming into a time of explosive, exponential spiritual development, a true before and after point in human history, a time of profound spiritual awakening. But I also saw that just as a mystic in going into this profound spiritual awakening goes through a dark night of the soul, which is a period of extended purification and letting go of everything that keeps them out of this mystical state. Likewise, humanity, in order to achieve this collective spiritual awakening, has to go through a collective dark night of the soul, a period lasting generations of profound surrendering, letting go, facing the karmic consequences of the choices that we have made collectively, the choices to divide the race by color, to divide the human race by different races, to divide them by religion, to divide them by class, all the divisions that we've made in history, which ultimately say, I'm important, you're not important, my group is important, your group is not important. All this history of division, which are basically have left scars in the fundamental oneness of existence, those choices have to be come to their karmic fruition. They have to be seen and understood for the damage that they have actually done. We must reassimilate our history. In this process, I saw that humanity was coming into a very, very challenging period, a period that would be experienced as a great falling apart, a global systems crisis that seemed to be generated by a global ecological crisis, global climate destabilization. It seemed as if the entire planet was going into planetary convulsions, leading to systematic collapses of infrastructure that we normally can assume, and that we were losing control of what we considered the normal and necessary circumstances of life. In this process of being broken down, there was something in this process that seemed to be breaking us into deeper and deeper levels of our being. Just when this process reached its peak, when it seemed as if all would be lost, that we were going into an extinction event, we came through this crisis. Things began to get better. And when we came through this crisis as humanity, we had been changed. We had been deeply and permanently changed by this crisis. New states of awareness were springing up, new understandings, new values, new social priorities, a deeper, and fundamentally what was happening is that oneness, which has been a universal spiritual teaching, had become a collective experience, that people had touched deeply into the oneness that we all share. And we began to rebuild our civilization based on the experience of the oneness of all life. And not just within human beings, but a oneness that we share with other life forms, with other species. This represented a fundamental turning point, a new platform. As I've come to understand it, I understand this as a shift which is taking place in the collective psyche. It is a shift in the fundamental architecture, the archetypal architecture of the collective psyche, so that any human being born after this shift takes place will basically be operating out of a different collective psyche. I don't know, I wasn't given any timetable, I wasn't given the specifics other than these broad categories. I don't know how long this period of the dark night of the soul will last. It seemed that it would be generations. It's not an easy or simple thing. It's not like flipping a switch. It's an evolutionary pivot. I was taken towards the end of my journey into the far future and given multiple experiences of what I call the future human, and what I, in a different context, call the birth of the diamond soul. I have a certain understanding of what the structure of the future human is from having experienced it, and I see this as the culmination of reincarnation. It is the culmination of a reincarnational process that we've been building toward this for generation after generation after generation, and there is a sense in which all of our former lives, I think, are coming together into one, and when they fuse into one, it leads to the birth of a new consciousness, the birth of a consciousness which is not individual egoic consciousness. It's not just physical consciousness. It is the birth of soul embodied in a physical body, so that we know ourselves not to be simply 100-year-old beings, but we know ourselves as 100,000-year-old beings, and we know each other as 100,000-year-old beings. And those are the beings who are building this new civilization. I think this is given, and these are visions that I was given over 20 years ago. I mean, I wrote about this in my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, that was published in 2000. And these are visions I had back in 1995, before I wasn't paying attention to the global ecological crisis. These are all predating those things. But it is a vision which has guided my life, and it gives me the context for understanding the COVID pandemic that we are facing, for understanding our spiral into ecological crisis that we are facing. And it gives me hope, because I think what's happening, certainly not that we are being punished, and not that we are entering into a mindless, unthinking ecological collapse, which is just driven by blind chance, but that I really truly believe that humanity is in the process of giving birth to its next form. It's giving birth to a new humanity. It's giving birth to a new consciousness that will live within the human species, that will have profound ramifications for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. This is a generational contribution, and I think that all of us have volunteered for this role. We all knew what we were getting into before we were born. We knew how hard it was going to be. We chose to incarnate at a time when we could be of service to this birth of a new humanity. Now, I know that's a radical vision. I know it's an audacious vision. I know that it's a very challenging vision, but I don't have any choice. This is simply what was the consistent set of visions that I was given over many years.
Well, thank you very much for sharing such an encouraging vision that we still need to take a deep breath before considering. It's basically obvious to many more people now this year that we're in for a rougher ride than probably any of us imagined. And the tools of economy, the tools of ordinary therapy, the tools that academia in its present state are providing, the tools that the internet are giving out are simply not nearly sufficient to equip us for such a radical purification, because that's really what it means, a very profound purification, but one that's leading to something. So the universe possesses or is a mind itself, a consciousness itself, with which we as individuals can indeed directly communicate, as you have proven during these 73 journeys. It can be done. Just that, for so many people, is a sign of hope, because so many, perhaps like yourself back when you were 30, had given up on spiritual ideas. It was all nuts and bolts physical reality, which I think is the mainstream view of reality that we all hold today. A consumerist society of materialists who truly believe that leaders and economic policies and carbon emission cuts are actually going to do the job. But you're referring to a shared collective mind in humanity itself, which has a purpose, has a direction, knows where it's going, and that this collective mind of humanity is inextricably linked with the mind of the universe as one whole sentient being. Just that, knowing that, is a massive contribution to human culture. And right now I'm saying thank you, thank you, thank you. This needs to be disseminated all over the world in as many languages as possible, as far as I'm concerned, Chris. And I say that as an avid reader of metaphysics, philosophy, religion, and as a practitioner of meditation, that this has come along at an incredibly important time. So whether you're a hardwired materialist or not, you owe it to yourself to at least consider the integrity of these reports, meticulously written down after each session, and how you used music during your session to make sure that you could reconnect with where you had been. Because as you mentioned, the shamanic self cannot often remember, when it comes back to this self, what happened. It's a classic double blind of metaphysical higher states. A lower state can't remember the higher state. That's the conundrum. But you recorded them. You actually wrote them down, and that is very significant. So now I'd like to just talk about the beloved, because many listening or watching this may not yet have felt that this was essentially a profound love affair with the universe, if I can be so cheeky as to say that. The beloved, you mentioned the beloved, and you talk about realizing that after the last session, you would no longer be able to have full access to the heart of the beloved, which must have been, even as mortal humans, the loss of the one we love. You can understand that, but you're talking about something at a different level. So bring us a bit closer to the beloved as a way of wrapping up.
When one enters into deep, non-ordinary states of consciousness, whether through meditation or through psychedelics, and the worldview that emerges overlaps. I mean, there's nothing unique in the psychedelic worldview. It is the same deep spiritual worldview that emerges in our very, very best, highest spiritual traditions. When one enters into these states of consciousness, one literally dies as one is, and one dissolves into some level of reality and lives for a period of hours, a day, in that level of reality, and then congeals back into your smaller, ordinary reality. And then dissolves a month later, 2 months later, dissolves again. And so it's literally these substances allow us to explode and to dissolve and to live and breathe as a different kind of being, with a different kind of intimacy with being itself. And so it brings with it a kind of tremendous intellectual expansion, a tremendous expansion of the heart, and encounters not only with the genius of the universe, but the extraordinary love that's inherent in the universe, overwhelming the compassion, which is the compassion of oneness. Because if the universe is one, then it is whole within itself, and then it has infinite love for each of its parts within its wholeness. Eventually this led me, after 15 years, I began to enter into states of extremely lucid states of consciousness that I came to call the diamond luminosity. Very, very, very hyper clear. And because I learned the spiritual literature, I knew that Buddhism's name for this state of awareness is Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality. When one dissolves into that, when one literally can become light for hours at a time, when one dissolves into the crystalline body of the divine, it awakens a profound sense of homecoming, return, reunion with the essence of being. And when one leaves it, it naturally leaves an ache to return. To return becomes the most powerful desire. And so it's like a romance. You spend time with your lover. You spend time with the universe in this exquisite intimacy that dissolves all boundaries. There is no you and it. You dissolve into the oneness of it. And then you crystallize back out of it. Now, there are some beings, great beings, and all honor to the masters, who can live in this state, can abide in this unitive state. And they were always my teachers for managing these conditions. But in my particular karma, my state, I could only enter into these states temporarily and then come out of it again. I had to learn how to not only embrace the beloved, but in the end, how to let go of the beloved, because I reached a point in my work where I came to the realization, or the universe gave me the realization, that it was time to end this particular journey. It was time to stop. I needed to consolidate myself more inside time and space, instead of shattering my time-space being and entering into the universal mind of the cosmos. And so I knew when I came to the ending that I would not return to this depth of intimacy with my beloved until I died. And I felt it was important for me to come back and to consolidate. When you dissolve this deeply into being light, then physical existence can begin to feel dried up. And it took me a while to really commit myself to being inside time and space, and to appreciating the magnificence of time and space as the manifest body of oneness, as the manifest body of my beloved, as the manifest body of the divine, of the Tao, of the Dharmakaya. That took years. It took me about 10 years to fully, in a sense, recover and to make my peace with being back in time and space permanently, and then to do the work which was mine to do, which was to share these things. I don't recommend that people go as deep as I went, the way that I went. I think I probably went deeper than was wise, precisely because it was so hard for me to come back. Coming down the mountain was as much of a challenge as going up the mountain, and I talk about this in the book. I think it's wiser to open up more gently, to open up to gentler states of consciousness, to let the universe in smaller increments. To me, it has been life transforming to learn, to discover, to be able to taste and feel the embrace of not only the intelligence of the universe, the magnitude, the genius of the universe, but also the depth of love that runs in the universe. And life is hard. I mean, let's face it, it is excruciatingly difficult to be a human being. It carries with it all sorts of pains. To see the compassion of the universe, you have to be able to look very, very deep. Because if you look just on the surface, you see as much pain as you see joy. You have to look deep into what the processes of creation are, what the processes of evolution are, what the processes of evolving humanity is about, where we are going, where we've come from, where we're going, in order to recognize that the universe loves us profoundly. It loves us so deeply and so profoundly that it's investing billions of years in evolving us and changing us and growing us, and we are not nearly at the end of our evolutionary story. We're just getting started. We just became conscious enough to begin to experience the consciousness that underlies all physical existence about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, which is a blink in the eye in evolutionary terms. And we're going to be going forward for millions and billions of years forward. We're just beginning to wake up to who we are. We're just beginning to wake up to the true being that a human being is. When one experiences the depth of our evolutionary story, and one experiences the genius that goes into creating the conditions that are evolving humanity, and the compassion that lies behind the gift of life, the gift of this evolving self that we are, this evolving capacity, then life has been disassembled and is being reassembled in a new way. Like these pictures, these beautiful pictures that are behind us. We are the first generation to see this deeply into the universe. We are the first generation to really look and see the scale and scope and beauty of these images that we are seeing. And likewise, we are penetrating deeply into the consciousness that manifested these magnificent galaxies and star clusters and nebulas that we are looking at. This is a whole new order. And it is a change, it's a change in our profound relationship with this universe, with the universe itself. It's not a cold, calculating, blind, indeterminate universe. It's a massively intelligent, alive, superconscious universe, which as we become more conscious of and enter into deeper communion with, it gives more and more of its gifts into our being, and our human condition is increasingly transformed. The future human is not just a human with an opened mind and an opened heart. It literally changes even our senses. We see differently, we hear differently, hyper open, higher, deeper and deeper states of awareness that emerge within our own body, within our consciousness. So for me, the psychedelic work is a story of a love affair. It's a love affair with the universe. And my beloved is my deepest lover in life. And that's why it took me so long to be able to share these experiences, because I'm sharing the deepest experiences of my life, my deepest experiences of the universe, of the divine. Now, if it were just me having the experiences, then they would be not important. It would be insignificant. But it's not just me. There are many, many people having these kinds of experiences. So we take strength, epistemological certainty in the legitimacy of these experiences from the number of people who are having these kind of experiences. So it's in the context of this revolution that I offer my experiences to others, not because I think they're unique, not because I think that they are, not because I think they're unique, but they are simply the most valuable thing I have to offer others at this particular time. Because where one of us can go, all of us can go. It's the potential that's important.
Again, thank you for such a brilliant synthesis of what you really are about, full of hope and love. And let us know then now, Chris, how you are communicating this extraordinary message to people with what you are associated, what institutes, what are you doing right now to keep this message alive and moving?
Well, you know, writing the book brought a tremendous sense of closure to me. It really felt like this was what I was supposed to do, to share these things. I don't have an agenda. I don't have a need, to convince or a need to persuade. The book is rolling out into the world. It's generating opportunities to have conversations like this conversation. Of course, with the pandemic, everything has shifted to online, which has had an expanding zone of contact. It's a tremendous honor for the book to be coming out in Japanese, because Japan, particularly Japanese Buddhism, has had such a deep impact on my life. It's just a tremendous honor for this work to be coming to the Japanese people. I just follow the opportunities as they present themselves. I'll be doing some online teaching, people who have read the book and want to have conversations around the book, psychedelic circles where they can share their own experiences and we can talk together about our mutual experiences. I hope once COVID gets under control, we get past COVID, that I'll be able to do some teaching, some physical presence teaching in the form of retreat. I'm not really interested in workshops, but extended retreats where we can gather for a week at a time and enter into contemplative discussion. Because when I talk about these things, naturally, when I remember these experiences, I enter into the edges of these experiences, and there is a transmission that takes place, and that's best done in person. And I look forward to more of that. But I'm content just to let opportunities unfold of their own accord. I'm finally, after all these years, a website will finally be up in a month or so, and that will increase access. So my job is simply just to be available for these kinds of conversations.
My job is to assist in the promulgation of such ideas into Japanese society using the written word, what we're doing now, the interview, but also workshops. We've done many workshops around the world with individuals who have unique skill sets. And so I'd certainly like to visualize why we are still incarnated here, getting together with a group of Japanese physically for such a retreat. Hopefully, the release of the book will generate, at this point in history, much more sincere study than it may have done 5 or 10 years ago, where it was so totally out there, totally occult and drug related. I think people are awake enough now to understand that that's not what you're talking about, and that we are indeed having some kind of, not just a psychedelic revolution, but an evolution in consciousness itself, and that your voice is important. So I look forward to doing what I can to help this process unfold with the Japanese. I too believe that the Japanese Buddhist tradition is incredibly rich and precious and has taught me so much and become a cornerstone of my life, and that they would truly appreciate what you have to say, and that would bring more opportunities for unfolding. That's really the purpose. Of course, this interview is open to anybody in any language, but specifically, it's to honor the publication of your book, translated by June. Her code name is June Angel. June Maimura has done a fantastic job of translating this book, A Natural Spirit. A small publisher, perhaps, but this publisher has always chosen deeply meaningful works that it knows probably won't sell, millions, but will get to the right people and help that transformation. You mentioned that doing these workshops, your presence is important. And I think I have to add here that in the book, you talk about how in the classroom setting, while you were a professor, even though you never mentioned psychedelics, even though it was never directly expressed, the fact that you were going through these profound changes relating to the mind of the universe seemed to impact the students. Maybe in conclusion, you could talk about that, because that's a kind of transmission that the Buddhist tradition and the Sufi tradition, many other traditions talk about.
Because consciousness is not private, our individual experience of our mind opens into an infinite field of mind, so that all of our minds are fractal, arising out of inclusive fields of consciousness. When one person goes through a deep purification processes and taps very deeply into larger patterns of mind, deeper currents of mind, it triggers effects in people around you who are sensitive. And many of my students, I began to discover over time, as I went deeper, they were being triggered. Their own purification processes were being triggered. Their own life growth processes were being triggered. That our minds were becoming transparent to each other in ways that I had not anticipated and had certainly not had intended. And I had to learn how to teach in an environment where this transparency was happening between teachers and students. And I learned that there are fields that grow up around in groups, that there are group fields, literally that there were fields growing up around the courses that I was teaching, that the longer I taught a course, the stronger the field of that course became. And it wasn't just my individual energy that was impacting my new students, but it was all the learning that previous students had gone through in this course was impacting the new students as they came in. This is a totally different way of thinking about teaching. It requires that we shift from an atomistic Newtonian pedagogy to a quantum pedagogy, to a transpersonal pedagogy. And so eventually I wrote a book called The Living Classroom, which is about these fields of consciousness and about energetic resonance that takes place in groups. And I didn't even mention psychedelics at all, because it's not about psychedelics. It's about the nature of consciousness itself. It just happens that psychedelics were my particular spiritual path. But if you were doing any spiritual practice that has the capacity to take you into these deep, deep states of consciousness, and there are many, you're going to trigger these same effects in the people around you. The mystical traditions know these things. It's just that we in the West have not really appreciated this contagious quality, that states of consciousness are contagious.
The pedagogy of the East is now so entirely materialistic that, for example, Oriental philosophy is all but completely unknown. So it's a really important time for you to be bringing this information. Japanese are very susceptible to what we call gai-atsu, which means outside pressure. If a Japanese was to deliver this lecture, having had the same experience, it would probably not have too much impact. Because it's coming from a Western academic who has a respect for the East, it has that effect of outside pressure, and people will listen and they will hear. Already, many parents are deeply disturbed about the way their children are being put through a university system that is entirely based on a materialistic paradigm, which will lead to work with a company. All of this is beginning to fall apart. The interest is there. I found through my own work that people are tremendously curious about consciousness. Their whole culture is based on imagination. It's based on a Shinto panoply of gods and goddesses, which is incredibly rich mythologically. And they still have shrines. They still have temples. But what they don't still have is the living tradition of quote unquote teacher and student, which was so important in the past. Teach by example. Teach what you really know. That's missing now. So it's a very good time to talk about education for the whole East-West, both sides. But I think that your message will be well received. I will do what I can, along with the translator and the publisher and other people, to bring this message to people's attention. This interview will be subtitled. Thank you so much, Chris. Now, is there any final word you would like to communicate, especially to our Japanese audience, given that you have some strong association with that culture?
Japanese culture has given me so much through time. It's an honor to be able to share experiences that I hope will speak to them as they speak to me. There is nothing east-west about these states of consciousness. They are states of consciousness. Our consciousness is consciousness. Whatever clothes we're wearing, whatever belief system we have about them, these states of consciousness transcend all my learning. They transcended everything I had learned from Western religions and what I had learned from Eastern religions, while at the same time honoring the elders of those traditions. It's an honor to be able to share them. Thank you very much, Echan, for helping bring this teaching to the Japanese culture. At the end of my sessions, my beloved, the mother, said to me, "Just let them see me as you have seen me." And that's all I've tried to do, to let other people see existence as I have been privileged to see it. And that's all, light touch, just to share that. And they'll know what to do with it. And I trust that people, I hope it will support them in their own life's journey. I hope it will empower them to pursue their deepest dreams and deepest aspirations. So it's just truly an honor to be able to share the work.
Thank you, Chris. I've taken up a lot of your time. I'll get on with editing, and then we'll start the amazing job of translating your erudite, that's the word, your erudite words into Japanese. And then we'll get back to you with the result and hope to meet you in person as soon as is COVID possible. Thank you, sir, and good day.
Thank you, Echan. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.